once you have a personality archetype established, it's fascinating to keep that the same, and then see variations based on other factors. A prime example would be seeing heroic and villainous versions of the same type. In this video, I want to muse about the evil versions of each type, and what that might look like. I will probably use fictional characters as examples throughout, just because they can be more blatantly archetypical, as opposed to real-life people who float in and out of these personality constructs. This video is almost what you would do if you were trying to write an evil or villainous version of each type. Lots of my thinking on this topic has been referenced in the series The Dark Side of Each Type, so feel free to check that out if you haven't already. ESTP, the impulsive psychopath and lovable rogue. The evil version of ESTPs that springs to mind is of the impulsive psychopath, which is kind of just a psychopath. I've spoken before about how psychopaths are masters of living in the moment, and they gain the benefits of, and suffer the consequences of, that approach to life. One thing that's quite remarkable to see is someone who is psychopathic, who might have a very high IQ, and is entirely rational, make really obvious mistakes for two reasons. One is that they often don't actually care that much about being caught, because they don't have that same sense of fear and terror that most people would have when committing a crime. That's also another reason why they can do it more easily too. It's kind of like if you removed a person's ability to feel pain. They wouldn't be less intelligent, or logical, or consciously understanding of danger, but they would start doing things that hurt them, just because they didn't have that same physiological deterrent of pain. The other reason is because they're not calculating the consequences of their actions either. They want to be satisfied and satiated in the moment, and that's all that matters to them. So when you see someone in fiction, or real life for that matter, who is seemingly psychopathic, yet has astonishing impulse control and are immense long-range planners, they're probably not pure psychopaths, so to speak. Maybe they have psychopathic traits mixed in with other things. I think that an evil or villainous ESTP really lines up well with this notion of an impulsive psychopath. Another archetype that fits them very well is that of the charming rogue. Someone who's likable, despite being on the wrong side of the law lots of the time. In this way, ESTPs and ENTPs can be quite similar. Both ENTPs and ESTPs can come across as someone like Jack Sparrow, for example. Roguish, amoral, but kind of lovable nonetheless. ISTP, the assassin or sellsword. Similar to INTPs, the ISTP route to villainy is often via detachment. Since people are often a source of insert negative words such as pain, contentiousness, difficulty, and so on, being able to switch off from and no longer have to value, worry about, or be tripped up by those interpersonal issues, that's an appealing thing for ISTPs at the best of times, certainly at the worst. The archetype of the assassin, or the sellsword, is one of a technician, someone who's achieved mastery with their craft, or multiple crafts, and is focused only on that, on analysing, understanding, then operating and performing at a high level. None of the vagaries of other people's emotions, or their own emotions for that matter, need to be danced around and accounted for. It's pure skill, mastery, and competence. Understanding and knowledge can now be weaponized without consequence or regard. Give them a name and they'll get the job done. No questions asked. So the villainous version of an ISTP is going to line up well with this notion of a sellsword, gun for hire, master assassin, or just someone who's great at their craft. For example, it could just as easily be a hacker or whatever. In fiction, characters like Bronn from Game of Thrones, maybe the Hound as well, are interesting examples. Those two are more anti-heroes, in some sense. Another famous example would be someone like Darth Maul, INFJ, the Puppet Master, or SVENGALI. This is a villainous archetype that also somewhat applies to INTJs as well, but much more to INFJs in my view. INFJs often have a strange kind of passivity to them. It's like they can live vicariously through their imaginary selves, but also through other people as well, especially people who they've influenced. It's like they are the sum of their influence in some sense. Being highly intuitive and typically people-focused, but also quite in their heads and cerebral, both combine to mean that they get a great kick out of influencing other people, be that with their ideas, insights, or just through conversation and advice, because that person can now take action based on that. They are essentially outsourcing the action to other people. A villainous INFJ would do this maliciously, either to just cause harm for the sake of it, or for some kind of personal gain and power. Both INFJs and INTJs fall into that archetype of being the power behind the throne, behind the scenes influencers, or manipulators in this case. In the case of INFJs, it's typically going to be more focused on people though. Evil INFJs want to control others first and foremost. Instead of using empathy as a tool to help people, it's weaponized and used against people. ENFJ, the slippery politician or cult leader. If you want to picture a villainous ENFJ, imagine the most smarmy and slimy, probably corrupt politician. And that's not far off. Someone who is about 1 capillary thick and has about as much depth as well. Pure, surface level, shape-shifting lizard-like, chameleon-esque vibes, in possession of a very human and convincing mask. The epitome of slippery style, masking, sinister substance. Another typical dark archetype of ENFJs is the cult leader. Again, this is very much leaning into their people skills, but just for malicious reasons. Relationship and community building is a chief skill of ENFJs. If you wanted to start an enterprise, namely a cult in this case, with one type at the head of it, then ENFJs would surely be the first pick. When it comes to politics, that relationship fostering skill is equally valuable, but also their other functions come into play too. Being able to construct lofty rhetoric and seduce with the power of their vision and ideas, as well as their charm, make them dangerously well suited to the role. ENTP, the agent of chaos or malevolent troll. ENTPs are very much in the mold of the jester archetype, someone who uses humour, roasting, satire, trolling, etc. as a way to point out the stupidity of people's or society's views. Also perhaps someone who intentionally adopts a comical or silly persona as a guise to conceal the fact that they're speaking truth. There is that trope in literature of the jester who is not taken seriously by the other characters, but is actually the wisest person in the room at any given point. Whenever people are attached strongly to something, whether that's an opinion or way of doing something, ENTPs often feel a revulsion to that, a need to challenge, refute, and contradict it, either verbally or just in the confines of their own mind. This is almost done reflexively and for its own sake at times. Probably the most famous ENTP villain is the Joker. This character takes that mindset to a philosophical extreme and challenges basically everything. All of the systems and structures in society and wants to undermine them all. Not for any kind of gain or personal benefit, but for its own sake. In that sense, the Joker is quite a philosophical villain. He delights in Batman as a rival, because Batman is, in many incarnations, the epitome of someone who is rigid and not going to budge on his principles. The Joker finds that kind of funny and silly, and loves to endlessly and brutally tease and torture him based on that rigid allegiance to his ideals. It's this notion of a malevolent troll that I associate with ENTPs. INTP, the mad scientist or outsider. Evil or villainous INTPs aren't actually as common as you might think. At least, I can't think of many obvious examples of them. As an archetype, to me it seems like detachment pushed to an extreme. It's when an INTP is pursuing something, let's say scientific innovation, just as a stereotypical example, without stopping to consider, or even without caring about, the ethical consequences of it. It's a pathological pursuit of progress based on logic, reason, and also simply curiosity. If there's a problem that they can solve, one that captivates them, and it has a huge amount of implications on humanity and society, a more villainous INTP would power forward with it regardless, maybe with the eventual aim to weaponize said technology for their own means. Their apathy might come from being outcast and isolated. There's them and their personal endeavors, then there's the rest of society, and both parties exist in a confrontational relationship. So if you have an INTP in your life who is isolated from people, you might want to check in with them because what they're working on could be unspeakably devious. And why wouldn't you want to get involved in that? ISFJ, the kill them with kindness caregiver. Certain types feature less as villains and have less evil incarnations because their archetype isn't as straightforward to translate to the dark side. I think the best example I've seen of this archetype, not necessarily the precise personality type, but this overall archetype, is Joe Goldberg from the series You. He's someone whose motivation is, at least in his own mind, altruistic and caring. He's trying to help and support the people in his life. But for many reasons, things take a much darker and deadlier turn. Another example would be in the book and film Misery. she's looking after him, but he doesn't really have a say in the matter and isn't allowed to escape. It's a kind of suffocating and smothering kindness, one that has a possessive nature to it. As with all of these types, any one of them could be evil in many ways, so rest assured that a multitude of villainy is still on offer. It's just that this is the combination of the ISFJ archetype and being villainous or evil. ESFJ, the host with the most to gain. ESFJs, like all of the high FE types, when evil or villainous, will still often look like they are the good guys. In fact, they might also see themselves as the good guys as well. The reason for the former is that ESFJs understand the game of appearances very well. They have a natural understanding of optics and the politics of relationships. If I had someone who I wanted to give a great experience to, I would pick an ESFJ to provide that experience. In fact, I know specifically which ESFJs I would choose. This brings up the central idea that underlies the villainous ESFJ. Just because you make people feel good doesn't mean you're not also doing them harm in some way. So an evil ESFJ would wrap people up in gloriously delicious experiences and situations, all the while advancing their own interests as a result. It might be particularly difficult to catch because it simply looks like reciprocity, and to a certain extent, that's exactly what it is. But the motivations and what can be gained is more sinister. ENTJ, the dictator. This one won't be surprising to anyone, really. ENTJs have a few natural attributes that make them well suited to being overlords. The first is the skill set that their functions afford them. Intense organizational ability, a strategic mindset, with the ability to both plan, but also not be overly attached to those plans. They are adaptable planners and schemers. Then there is the way they come across. Commanding, in charge, and charismatic in a way that makes other people want to follow them. Much like the ESFPs, ENTJs can have a confidence that does a lot of the heavy lifting for them. If you believe in yourself, then other people might be more likely to do the same. When you look at the story of many dictator characters, actually many real-life dictators as well, they come to power by opportunistically claiming the throne for themselves. When there's a power vacuum, people look to the person who displays or projects the most strength. ENTJs do this brilliantly, and it's no surprise that many of the evil ENTJs in fiction find themselves at the very top of a malevolent hierarchy. INTJ, the man or woman behind the curtain. Very similar to the INFJ type of villain in many respects. The only difference is that INTJs are going to be more strategic in nature, more focused on things other than just people, even though it would certainly include that kind of manipulation as well. INTJs tend to accrue power quite naturally, but the snag that they will regularly encounter is having to deal with some of the more superficial aspects of the conventional workplace. In fact, that kind of politicking happens even in unconventional workplaces too. One way around this is to gain as much power independently, to build up your foundational power and influence as much as possible. Then you have leverage when you're dealing with people. So villainous INTJs will be hyper-focused on building these secretive power bases and expanding behind the scenes, doing as much work as possible in the shadows. Then there's another common thing for INTJs to experience. That is being thrust into leadership positions, kind of because other people are not up to the task. If INTJs can have a front-facing person whilst pulling the strings from behind the scenes, more often than not, they're going to love that. Perhaps someone like Emperor Palpatine is a good example of one of these characters. In the original trilogy, he is hardly known to the audience, while he has one of the most prominent and imposing fellow villains to carry out all the plans, manage things on the ground level, and be the face of the Enterprise. Or Empire, in this case. ISFP, the Revenger. ISFPs are another type that are quite rare as villains. The archetype that springs to mind here is of someone who is wronged and then goes completely rogue. Imagine that character who is completely driven by a personal vendetta and the need for vengeance. They no longer care about the impact of their actions on other people. It's about rectifying this violation that they felt. Someone like the bride from Kill Bill, for example, technically she's not a villain as such, but, you know, she does kill a hell of a lot of people. Either way, it's that archetype. It's being so obsessed with their personal feelings and story that they're willing to tear everything down with that fury and rage. The reason I think this is well suited to the ISFP personality is because they will rarely be the aggressor in a situation, but can definitely push back with a huge amount of passion, forcefulness, and also just anger. So it's like they need to be triggered by something, or have that darkness within them unlocked by some other event. Then the beast will be unleashed. ESFP, the confidence trickster. ESFPs might have the most natural combination of charisma and charm, depending on the mood they're in. Using their allure and natural attractiveness deviously is what I imagine when thinking about villainous ESFPs. It's the archetypical confidence trickster or con man, someone who, simply by virtue of their sheer presence and force of personality, can convince others to trust them, take them seriously, and let them get away with things just because they seem to be legit. It's about leveraging their natural capacity to feel comfortable, self-possessed, and at ease in almost any situation. Because they feel calm and comfortable and confident, it inspires those kinds of feelings in other people as well. An example that came to mind, this character isn't exactly a villain, but the archetype still makes sense, is Neil Caffrey from the TV series White Collar. He's someone who gets by on charm, finesse, and sheer adaptability. He is unflappable and unfazed, even in the face of extremely dangerous and chaotic situations, allowing him to scam people for millions of dollars. His immense self-belief becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is something that's common for ESFPs. ENFP, the chaotic revolutionary. ENFPs, at their best, are change agents, people who challenge preconceptions in multiple ways and through a multitude of mediums. However, ENFPs at their worst are also change agents. There's two ways this can happen. One is being so changeable to the point that they are erratic. The other is being so attached to the idea of change that they'll recklessly seek it out. This kind of thinking is evident in revolutionaries who are philosophically attached to their ideologies, even if those would result in more harm than good. I think a good recent example is Jinx from the series Arcane. I'm not entirely sure of her type actually, but ENFP does seem to fit from what I remember. She's someone who is liable to switch sides completely, depending on her emotional reactions to things, and is exceptionally changeable in that regard. She also, for personal reasons, and an attachment to certain ideas and ideals, is willing to recklessly cause an unbelievable amount of damage and chaos. Also, just as an aside, I watched a video recently where someone pointed out that she's an extremely unusual example of a character that could be classified as a chaotic evil in the moral alignments, which I would agree with, yet is still somehow one of the heroes of the story that we root for, to some degree. So an evil ENFP would be either, or perhaps both, dangerously erratic, including morally, and at the head of a reckless revolution. INFP, the dangerous dreamer, or crusader. One of the most difficult types to classify into a villainous archetype. I think they would be similar to the ISFPs, in the sense that it would be a villainy triggered by some kind of deeply personal issue, or trauma even. Some examples that came to mind in fiction were Sweeney Todd and the Phantom from the Phantom of the Opera. I'm not sure why my mind went straight to musicals. Maybe it's because I have this assumption that INFP villains would still be creative or artistic in some way. Or at least that would be the most stereotypical way to villainize the INFP personality type. I've also seen Kylo Ren typed as an INFP before, whereas the high FE types will often come across as being the good guys, even when they're not. High FI types tend to feel a sense of justification in what they're doing. In that sense, they're kind of crusaders that might feel like what they're doing is right in some kind of way. As I've mentioned in previous videos, INFPs are prone to feelings of disillusionment, so if they put their faith into something or someone, and that thing or person lets them down, that's when their dark side can come out in a big way. Again, it's a case of feeling personally justified and damning the wider consequences of the path you take. ISTJ, the enforcer. ISTJs are people who advocate for structure, order, organization, rules, logic, and principle. They are every bit as logical as any of the thinking types, sometimes more so, in fact. It's just that they value the integrity of systems much more. They are happy to compromise in the name of order, and often have great disdain for people who want to reinvent the wheel and revolutionize things, without actually considering the negative consequences of doing so. If you take this to an evil extreme, then you have an archetype who would, in the name of order, uphold a system or regime that was dangerous or damaging to the people under it. For example, if you were writing two dual characters, so types that have the same functions, but in the opposite orders, and you wanted to make them both morally ambiguous, i.e. justified in some ways, but at fault in others, you could have an ISTJ who realizes fully that a particular regime is bad, but on balance, they think that the chaos of changing it would be worse and cause more harm. Then you could have an ENFP revolutionary that thinks the destruction of tearing things down, whilst being bad, is actually worth it in the end. And if you wanted to be really unusual, you could actually swap those roles and have an ISTJ who wants change and an ENFP who wants to maintain. That's an example of how these personality archetypes make great tools for writing characters. ESTJ, the subjugator. ESTJs are kind of like a hybrid of the ENTJ and ISTJ when it comes to villainy. In the name of things working effectively and efficiently, they end up treating people like they are cogs in a huge juggernaut machine, stamping out individuality in the name of standardization. Everything is working smoothly and running exactly on time and to schedule. ESTJ bliss. The price is that every person who is dependent on this machine, or perhaps working as part of it, has to subjugate themselves and suppress any disagreements they might have with it. An evil ESTJ wants people to get in line or suffer the consequences of not doing so. Often some of these personalities get portrayed as boring, which is very annoying. For example, you might think that the evil ESTJ would be a very boring character in fiction. But I think that Darth Vader is a perfect example, and he's one of the most iconic villains and just characters in history. It simply depends on how well written the character is. Darth Vader is kind of terrifying because he's just getting on with the job and getting it done. His walk is ultra businessman-like, ticking things off his malevolent to-do list. And, as I often say about ESTJs, he is hilariously witty, albeit in a very dark kind of way. He wants to bring order to the galaxy and finds himself in that position of letting another person take care of the overall vision so that he can focus on implementing and executing in every sense of that word. If you want to begin your path to villainy, then start by subscribing to this channel.